Morning, LifePoint. How you doing this morning? Hey, great to have you here this morning. My name is Shawn Williams. As Rusty mentioned, I'm a teaching pastor at a church called Central Church in the Las Vegas area. But I'm pumped to be with you this morning. I understand that there's a Seahawks game that started 4 minutes ago, and you're here. So the way I like to say that is I think that you all earned 7 Jesus points. I don't know what you used Jesus points for, but we're going to give them out this morning anyway. Really glad that you're here. As Rusty mentioned, we're good buddies. I don't know if that helps my cause or hurts my cause, but very grateful for Rusty, who he is, just his leadership. And so he called me up a couple weeks ago and he said, hey, would you come speak at LifePoint? I was amped. I was pumped. Absolutely. I would love to come be a part of what God is doing there. So what are we talking about? He said, well, we're in a series called Kill What's Killing You. It's a series about emotions. It's like, Rusty, I don't have any emotions. When God created me, he skipped over the emotion aisle. I kind of live life as a pretty steady type of guy. I'm like, bro, you got to give me an emotion that I got some experience with. I don't live a very emotional life. He said, well, how about you talk about anger? Like, I can do that. I've experienced that in life a time or two. I tend to be somebody again that I don't live with really extreme emotions. I tend to have actually a pretty long fuse most of the time. But I don't know what your life is like. Eventually, if somebody wears on that fuse long enough, eventually that fuse will run completely empty. And I've been known at times to have my anger outbursts, right? When that fuse finally goes all the way through. I know that we don't know each other really well, but you look like really great people, so how about I be a little vulnerable and I'll let you in on one of those stories. It happened not too long ago, just a couple weeks ago. I brought a picture of my family with me. This is my beautiful wife on the far left. My oldest son, Levi's, next to her. Austin's my crazy little guy with blue hair. He's a big fan of the YouTuber Dan TDM, hence the blue hair. And then that guy on the far right, man, that guy's ridiculously good looking. But anyway, that's my family. My oldest son, Levi, great kid. I mean, he really is. Super smart, really intelligent. But he's also got a great heart to him. He's a super kind, compassionate, really caring kid, pretty others-focused. But he's 12. He's about to turn 13. And all of a sudden, as he approaches his teenage years, somebody stole my, kind, caring, compassionate kid. He's still pretty much that way with everyone else, but something has happened with how he relates to his parental units. And it's like the ball game has changed in my household. Now, I was a youth pastor for a lot of years, so I understand the dynamics of the teenage years, but I'm telling you, it is easier to pastor teenagers than parent teenagers. When I'm pastoring teenagers, I get to send them home. When I parent teenagers, that's where I live too. And so, there's some challenges there, right? Now in my household, and my oldest son, he knows this. I'm okay if my son disagrees with me. Like if we don't see eye to eye about something, if I'm talking about something that he doesn't like, he can disagree with me, but he can't disrespect me. And for me, that's one of my, buttons. If you disrespect me, my long fuse becomes short really, really quickly. And there was a decision that he made that I believed was pretty far outside of what the expectation of him is in my household. And so we were having a conversation about the choice that he made. And I was coming at him a little bit strong, and I could see in him. I mean, he immediately became really defensive in his posturing. He really started to kind of dig his heels in, and he was firing right back at me. Now, again, you can disagree with me all day long, just don't be disrespectful. And he crossed that line with me. And he started pushing every button that he knew was going to make that fuse erupt really, really quickly. And again, he knows me well enough to know which buttons to push, which just made me more angry, right? And I could feel it boiling inside of me. I was the teapot sitting on the open flame. It was a matter of time before you hear the whistle blow. I was feeling it. Now, as a parent, if I would have exercised wisdom in that moment, I would have separated us, I would have sent him to his room, I would have allowed cooler heads to prevail, and I would have made a better decision. I didn't exercise wisdom in this particular situation. And I just continued to engage the conversation. And the more it went, the more it was beginning to escalate. And finally, I was coming down on him about something in particular, and he finally decided he was going to throw the dagger. And he looked at me and he said, "You're a lousy father. I haven't done anything wrong." And I went from 0 to volatile like that, right? And again, I kind of just lost my composure. And to that, without skipping a beat, I said to him, "You are such an entitled, ungrateful kid. You've never done anything wrong in your entire life." And the moment those words flew out of my mouth, I was like, "Ah!" Trying to get the words back, but you can't get them back, right? And I saw when those words landed on him, I saw it in his eyes, I had wounded him. And I had wounded him deeply because I crossed a line that parents cannot cross. In the sense that it was no longer a conversation about his behavior. I took a shot at his character. And I was out of bounds. I was in the wrong. And he ran away to his room, just completely devastated. It didn't remove from the things that he had done wrong, but again, I just equaled his wrong and I just leveled it up one. And I recognized that I'm the adult in the equation and I failed to act like the adult in the equation. It took me a little bit of time, but eventually when I had calmed down, I went up to his room, we had a conversation about it, I fell in the grenade, I took full responsibility, I asked for forgiveness, and it actually ended up being a great moment. But if I could go back, if I could rewind the clock, I would have made a very, very different decision. You ever been there? Thanks for saying yes, because if not, it was going to be a pretty, lonely moment. We've all been there. In some relationship, whether it's a relationship at work, whether it's an extended family, whether you're a parent and it was your kid, whether you're a kid and it was your parent. Like, we've all been there, right? We've all been at those moments that you feel like the anger welling up inside of you that many times compels us to do things that are out of character for us. It causes us to say things we wouldn't typically say or do things that we wouldn't typically do. And we live with an immense amount of guilt and regret because of those types of decisions. So the heartbeat of the series is how do we kill things before they kill us? How do we deal with these things before they, really deal with us? But I work under this premise. I think that all emotions that God has given us, God gave us for a purpose. No emotion in of itself is actually bad. But sometimes if we're not careful, these emotions can lead us to bad decisions. And so the question becomes, how do we leverage this thing called anger for the purposes that God gives it to us, but we don't misuse it or misapply it, and so it compels us to do things that are outside of what God would desire? And so to have this conversation, I want to take us to a kind of an interesting story about a great, great man in biblical times, a guy by the name of Moses, a pretty well-known guy. And you know Moses' story because he was the guy that God chose to lead God's people out of Egypt and ultimately toward the promised land. Now you think about the amazing leadership that Moses exercised, that he was leading hundreds of thousands, some scholars say well over 1 million people out of slavery to the land that God had promised them. The amazing amount of leadership that it would take to do what Moses did was amazing. But out of Egypt, again, they didn't go directly to the promised land. They ended up wandering around the desert for almost 40 years. And in that time, the people started getting a little tired of it, and there was a lot of grumbling and complaining and all kinds of things that began to characterize that journey. But toward the end of the journey, when they're literally standing on the cusp of finally being able to get into the promised land, Moses kind of had enough. There'd been enough building in him over the course of time that he ends up kind of losing his marbles in front of the entire nation. And so what had happened is they journeyed to this new area, and there really wasn't any water to drink. And again, there's hundreds of thousands of people without the access to one of the most basic and necessary needs, right? And so they come to Moses and say, what are we supposed to do here? We don't have access to water here. So Moses is like, I don't know, let me go talk to God. And so he goes, talks to God and says, what should I tell the people? And so God, who had been the provider every single step of the way, said, here's what we're going to do. I want you to go get your staff. I want you to assemble all the people, and then when you do so, I want you to speak to a rock, and I'm going to miraculously bring water out of the rock. It was going to be this amazing, provision of God. It was going to be another one of those things that God demonstrated as faithfulness to people. And Moses almost did what God asked him to do. Here it is, Numbers chapter 20. I think we're going to start in verse 9. It says this. It says, so Moses did what he was told. He took the staff from the place where it's kept before the Lord. So step one, check. Then he and Aaron summoned the people to come to gather at the rock. Step two, check. But here's where it goes sideways. When all the people were together, here's what Moses said. Listen, you rebels, he shouted. Must we bring you water from this rock? And then Moses raised his hand and he struck the rock twice with the staff, and water gushed out, so the entire community and their livestock drank their fill. Now notice, God still showed up, and God still provided for the community, but Moses didn't actually do exactly what God had asked him to do. He did get the staff, Check. He did assemble the people. Check. And then when the entire nation was assembled, he lost his marbles, calling them names, you rebels. He didn't speak to the rock. He took his staff and he just starts beating the eber-jeebers out of this rock, kind of taking out his anger on this kind of full display. I would suggest that in this moment, Moses loses more than his temper. Moses loses his credibility as a leader in front of the entire community. And it ends up being, ultimately, we'll discover a little bit later, it ends up being Moses' undoing as a leader. But we've had those moments. Again, no matter how it looks, that we've experienced these moments where the anger wells up inside of us and it causes us to do something or say something that's out of our character. So the question becomes, how do we deal with anger before it deals with us? In order to have this conversation, I want to walk us through what I believe to be a few different myths around anger. Here's the first myth. Sometimes we believe that anger is automatic. That my anger is it just kind of just is what it is. I ran across this on social media, I believe this week, that says, never in the history of calming down has anybody ever calmed down when told to calm down, right? How true is that? The worst thing you can ever say to somebody when they're angry is to calm down. That only, fuels the fire. And sometimes we believe that anger is just automatic. It just is what it is. And some even psychology would suggest that when you feel it inside, you got to get it out. You got to express it. However you need to express it is totally fine. You just have to express that anger because it would eat you up inside. It's almost like we remember Bruce Banner, that when Bruce Banner gets hot around the collar, at some point, Hulk's going to show his face. And Hulk is going to do whatever Hulk's going to do. It eventually becomes the moment when it becomes Bruce Banner again, and all of a sudden Bruce Banner's got to clean up the mess that Hulk has made and find a new pair of pants, right? But sometimes we believe that it's just automatic. It just is what it is. It just has to be expressed. I would argue that there's greater wisdom than that. And though there's a sense that anger can stir inside of us, anger doesn't have to have as much control on us as sometimes we allow it to. I think about it this way. Anybody ever seen one of these lamps? I think it's called a plasma lamp. You ever seen one of these? Yeah. And so I don't know how these things work. It looks like there's some sort of, chemical reaction taking place in there. I don't know what this is. But if you know what these lamps look like, the moment you touch it, you can see that there's some sort of reaction that's drawn to, your touching of it. And I think in many ways, anger can work like this. It's always stirring inside of us. The question is, will we give it the power to dictate what we do? Will we lean into it? I think sometimes anger can fuel more anger. Sometimes anger can be somewhat addictive if we allow it to have the power that sometimes it wants to play in our life. So for example, you're woken up in the morning by your neighbor's dog. And you kind of think to yourself, man, my neighbor is so inconsiderate. And they don't even really do anything about it. Doesn't care about anything else around him. And that thing that happened begins to charge my life. And then I walk downstairs and I go to the refrigerator looking for some milk for my cereal, and I find out that somebody put a milk jug that's got 3 drops of milk back in the refrigerator. I mean, seriously, why would she do that? I mean, it's like, seriously, like, are you just thinking of, like, why would you make, and those things begin to charge us. They begin to fuel us. Or you're on your way driving to work, and there's the person who's driving in the fast lane and going 30 miles an hour. And they got their blinker on, but they don't ever go anywhere. And you're like, are you just oblivious to the entire world around you? And it begins to charge you and fuel you. Or you think about, last weekend when your friend who's a Patriots fan calls you to ridicule you for the Ravens' win over your Seahawks. Moral of that story, do not be friends with Patriots fans. That's what we learned. But that stuff fuels us, right? And the reality is when we finally snap, like when the fuse finally goes off, more often than not, it has very little to do with the actual event in that moment. It's actually charged by all kinds of other things that we've allowed to give it power. It's what's grown and festered over the course of time that eventually erupts in a particular moment. That's what happened to Moses. Again, we know if you just rewind the clock in Numbers chapter 20 and you look at what led up to that moment, here's what we know about Moses. Moses had actually just experienced loss. He just lost a relative. And there's a lot of emotions that are associated with loss. One of them is anger. What we know about Moses is he had led the people, around for 40 years, and everywhere they went, they were grumbling, they were complaining, they were saying, hey, we were better off in Egypt. And here's this man of God who's doing everything that God's desiring and is doing such an incredible work on behalf of the people, what he had sacrificed. There's not an ounce of gratitude that's being poured back to him. Instead, it just comes across this entitlement type of approach, and it's incredibly frustrating. You think about Moses, not only did they just get discouraged at times, they became incredibly critical with Moses at times, really communicating to him that he was an incompetent leader, not able to do what God was asking him to do. It's amazing how that can charge us up at times. And so when Moses gets to this moment about the rock, it really wasn't about the rock. It's about everything else that had built up in that moment. It just happened to be the venue where he exploded in front of all the people. So the question becomes, with all the things that happen in and around us that many times fuel us, how do we make sure that those things no longer have the power that they once did? How do we even disempower it so it doesn't dictate our actions? I think one of the ways that we can go about this that can create some incredible wisdom for us is kind of framed up in this way. I think there's a difference between what happens and the narrative that we create about why it happened. If you think about all the different things that we experience in life, there's what happens, but more often than not, we create a narrative about it, about why that person did what they did, about what they're thinking, about what they're feeling. And the truth is, we actually don't have any idea. We don't know anything about their motives. We don't know anything about the why. We don't know anything about the narrative. We generate the narrative, and oftentimes it's the narrative that fuels the anger, not just the incident in of itself. It's what we believe to be true about that person that fuels the narrative. And the truth is, it's a gap is what I would call it. We have no idea what their motive is, and so I'm going to make an assumption about what their motive is. And I will either assume the best about them, or I will assume the worst about them. And when I assume the worst about them, that narrative will fuel the anger in my life. When that neighbor's dog is barking, he's either an incredibly inconsiderate human being, or there's something going on in his life. Or he's unaware of what's taking place. And if I make the assumption that's a positive assumption, generous assumption on their behalf, it's amazing that no longer has the fuel and the power that it once did. When I walk downstairs and see the empty milk jug, I can frame the narrative that they are inconsiderate, selfish, and don't care about anybody else other than themselves. Or I can assume, you know what, they just made a simple mistake. They just weren't really thinking in the particular moment, and all of a sudden, it loses its power. I can get really fueled up about the person driving in the slow lane, but the reality is I don't know them. I don't know the journey. I don't know what they're struggling with. I don't know what's going on. Potentially there's something that's really holding them down, that's causing them to do what they're doing in the moment. If I give people the benefit of the doubt, it's amazing how it loses so much power in my life. Now, when it comes to Patriots fans, there's no hope for them. But you understand the scenario, right? That there's wisdom that we can implement in our life so that anger no longer really calls the shots in our journey. Anger is not automatic. Here's the second myth. Sometimes we believe that anger is always bad. Anger is always bad. And maybe because we've been the recipient of other people's anger, and so we have such a bad or negative associated with it anger. Or maybe, in the moments that we've kind of lost our marbles, we've experienced so much guilt. And so we operate under the premise that it's all bad and always bad. I ran across this on social media as well. I thought this was kind of funny. It says, never irritate a woman who can operate a backhoe. I have no idea what the guy did. I think she took it easy on him. She could have buried his truck, or maybe even worse, buried him. But nevertheless, sometimes we have this associated that all anger is bad. But again, taking us back to where we started earlier in this conversation, I think that every emotion that God gave us, He gave us for a purpose. And there's actually even a good purpose for anger. Not all anger is bad or wrong. I think there's something that I would call a righteous anger. You recognize it because even God Himself gets angry. And what we know about God is God can't sin. And so anger in of itself is not a sin. It can just lead us to sin if it goes unchecked. Tim Keller is a fantastic thinker and pastor. He says it this way. He says, anger was designed to protect something good from something bad. So for example, if somebody's being bullied, the person who begins to stand up for the bully a lot of time is not stand up for the bully. How about stand up to the bully? That particular person oftentimes is motivated by a righteous sense of anger. Anger has the way of bringing about change in areas of injustice, in areas where things are not right. Anger was designed to stand up for what's good in the face of what's bad. Not all anger is bad. And there's actually some things that we should be angry about. Book of Ephesians says it this way. This is the Message translation of Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. It says this. God says, go ahead and be angry. You do well to be angry, but just don't use your anger as a fuel for revenge, and don't stay angry. Don't go to bed angry, and don't give the devil that kind of foothold in your life. In other words, in some situations, God actually gives permission for anger, and it's actually the right thing to do. There are things in our world that, frankly, we should be angry about. For example, cancer makes me angry. My father-in-law is battling stage 4 lung cancer right now. I'm watching the toll that it's taking a man that I deeply love, who's the most life-giving, one of the most life-giving people I know. And frankly, cancer makes me angry. Injustice makes me angry. Abuse makes me angry. Racism makes me angry. When people get separated or cut off from the redemptive grace of God because somebody puts an obstacle in their life, that makes me angry. There are some things that we should get angry about in our world. It's a righteous sense of anger. The anger in of its sense is not a sin. I would say that when we're not angry about some things, maybe that's a sin, right? There's some things we should be not okay with in our world. And I would say some of the greatest changes that our world has known, those changes were called to action when people finally got angry enough to do something about it. And sometimes anger is a very righteous thing and of God. Anger is not always bad. It's a myth. Anger's not automatic. Anger's not always bad. Here's the third myth. Sometimes we believe that anger helps me get my way. Sometimes we're convinced that anger helps me get my way. So, you think about, there are people who will use anger as a tool or leverage in some way. Sometimes bosses will use anger to get employees to do what they want them to do. Sometimes customers in restaurants or in hotels, or when something doesn't happen to the customer's pleasure, sometimes they will exercise anger in order to get the establishment to do what they want. Sometimes as parents, we will exercise anger in order to get our kids to do what they want. And so sometimes we even see anger as an effective tool in that way. I would argue in some ways it can short-term be true, but in the long haul, it will cost us way more than we ever gained. It's true that sometimes you can get short-term results if you exercise anger towards somebody. You can maybe force that person to do what you want them to do. But if you're in a relationship with that person for any amount of time, whether it's a work environment, that person's on your team, whether that's a home environment, that person lives in your household, if that becomes the characteristic long term, you actually end up losing a lot of credibility in the relationship. You may get what you want in the moment, but you end up losing a lot of credibility in the long haul. And that's what I would argue happened with Moses. Look what happened in the very next verse of the passage we read earlier. It says this. It says, "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness to the people of Israel, you will not lead them into the land I'm giving them." Now, we read that and we're like, well, okay, so he doesn't get to go to the promised land. No. I mean, for Moses, that would have been everything. I mean, he was the one called by God to lead people out of Egypt into the promised land. That was the destination. That was the ultimate goal. He had been waiting for 40 years, for the opportunity to lead people to the ultimate destination that God had called him to. And now they're literally standing on the brink of it, and God says, you no longer get to go. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can look at it. One of the ways you could say, well, maybe that's because God was being punitive, that God was punishing him for his lack of obedience. Maybe. Another way to look at it is this, is that when Moses erupted in front of the entire nation of people. Moses actually compromised his own credibility to lead. He forfeited his own right of leadership. Because leadership requires great trust. It requires great leadership, great credibility. And in his moment, in his fit of rage, he had compromised his trust and credibility, and the truth is the people would no longer follow him. That God removed him because they needed a trusted leader who could truly get them to where they were ultimately going. It's possible that Moses didn't just lose his temper. He lost his credibility to do what God had called him to do. And so sometimes we think about anger as it's a tool that we need to get what we want. But I would argue over the long haul, it costs us way more than we're really wanting to pay. And that ultimately there's got to be a better way. It kind of reminds me of when my oldest son was really little. I don't mean to be picking on him so much, especially when he's not here. But when my oldest son was really little, he's probably 2 or 3 years old, we had just purchased a computer for our house, kind of a household computer. I thought it was fairly nice. It had a little bit of value, to us. And my son took a permanent marker and colored legitimately the entire thing. Keyboard, screen, the whole thing. And he just thought he was just making a little artistic piece. And unfortunately, he didn't pick up one of those Crayola washable markers. Of course, he picked up the permanent one and just made a statement. Now, my wife walked into the scenario and saw it. I was at work at the time, and she flips out, and she knew that I was going to flip out. So, she helped a brother out. She placed a phone call to me to kind of warn me about what I was going to come home to. And I remember her telling me, and I felt it in the moment. I was so frustrated. I was so angry because it was something that had really been destroyed, something that I found some value in, right? And I remember kind of thinking about it, stewing on it, but the more time that passed, I really kind of calmed down. I thought, you know what? He's a kid. Why should I be surprised that he did something that kids do, right? As I remember, getting home, and I calmed down. I tried to do my best to clean it up and get one of those magic erasers that seemed to solve everything, even though it didn't solve this one. And so the best cleaning job possible still left a lot of marks on my computer. Now, I could have been mad on the long term, but instead, the best thing I knew how to do was kind of reframe it, so that really every time I used that computer, I would be reminded of Levi's love marks that he left for me. And I'd be reminded about how much I love my kid. And I'll be reminded about how much my kid actually does love me. And to choose to see it as love marks really changed the entire perspective. And it takes the power away from anger. I think in many ways that kind of reminds me of kind of the core of who Jesus is. You think about the cross of Jesus Christ. You think about an environment that he had every opportunity to be angry. It was just a world of injustice that he was falling victim to. But in the moment, Jesus never responded with anger or rage. Instead, it was on that cross that he spoke the words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And forgiveness has this ability of taking the power away from godless anger. It has the way of almost being the antidote of anger to the place that we truly can be set free. In a sense, on the cross, you see the markings of Jesus' love all over our lives and all over his redemptive work in our world. Forgiveness has this way of truly setting us free. Today's a very special weekend for us, right? I want to celebrate those of you who are going to be baptized this weekend. That's awesome, really, really incredible. Really, it's the forgiveness of Jesus that's ultimately set us free, and we're gonna celebrate that. And so we're going to watch a quick video of life change of somebody who's experienced God's freeing act right here at LifePoint. Then we're going to watch some baptisms after this video, but you know what we do around here at LifePoint? We believe that every time somebody comes up out of the water, there's a party in heaven. And people, in heaven, they're screaming and shouting. There's a whole party in heaven. And so we're going to reflect that party right here in this room. So I want you to scream. I want you to shout. I want you to really celebrate in a really powerful way as we get to celebrate the lives of the people. But before we do that, let's check out Taylor's story.
I grew up where we didn't have any religious background at all. And I remember when my grandma passed away, I was like 14 years old. Not long after that, I actually ended up just kind of downward spiraling and doing like really bad things at a really young age. I ended up pregnant at 14, had a baby at 15. I really wanted to go, and I was really like being drawn to it. So when we tried to go to church, they were like, "Oh, this is your baby?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Oh, okay." And you could just tell, they wouldn't directly say anything. You could just tell that I didn't belong there. So from that point on, I was just like, all right, church isn't for me. This is life. Like, I'm gonna live and I'm gonna die, and that's it. So like, why does any of this matter? It doesn't matter. So I ended up having 2 more kids through other situations. I was like laying in bed and I turned on my phone and I'm like watching it. I got into like a minute of Rusty speaking, and I immediately like stopped it and called my friend. I was like, "Get up, we're going." I remember like walking in and was introduced to someone who's now a good friend of mine, and was immediately welcomed. And I remember sitting there and I was like, wait, so despite everything that I did, like, I can be forgiven for that? Like, there can be, like, there's hope for me? God picked that day and time for Rusty to speak those words to me, and it was like, I immediately had goosebumps that just went from like my head all the way down. And it was like, there was something inside of me that was like, okay, you're where you're supposed to be. Like, I told you it would be okay. Like, you're fine. Just keep on going, keep on going. And that was the day that I decided to give my life to Jesus. Not long after first attending LifePoint, I decided to get baptized. I remember walking up there and I was baptized, and then afterwards threw my hands up, was like all excited and stuff, and it was so cool. A year ago today, if I had to describe my life, it would be very similar to the way that the Bible describes the earth in the very beginning. It was dark and formless and empty. I look at my life now. When times are hard, I feel hope.